Hi, my name is Pamela Tishman. I'm a member of the Civil Rights Committee at the New York City Bar, and I wish to welcome everyone to this event, the New York State ERA, which is on the ballot in November. I'm sure that you will find the discussion really interesting and informative. So the program is sponsored by the following New York City Bar committees: the Civil Rights Committee, Sex and Law Committee, and the LGBTQ Committee. And the co-sponsoring organization is the New York City Bar Office for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. We would also like to thank the New York City Bar for all its help in organizing this event. So towards the end of the discussion, we will be collecting note cards. I think most of you have gotten note cards if you want them, and you can write down questions. And one of us will be at the end of each row, towards the end, collect the note cards, and then we'll be giving them to the moderator. And talking about the moderator, I would like now to introduce our moderator, Jessica Neuwirth. Jessica Neuwirth has worked for the human rights organization Amnesty International, for the Wall Street law firm of Cleary Gottlieb, and for the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. She has also served as the New York Director for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She is one of the founders and honorary president of Equality Now, an international women's rights organization that was established in 1992. And the founder and director of Frontline Women's Fund, an offshoot project. It's now hosted by Sisterhood is Global Institute to support women's rights organizations around the world. She's also the founder and president emerita of the ERA Coalition, mobilizing a renewed effort to get the Equal Rights Amendment into the U.S. Constitution. And to aid this effort, she has written a book titled Equal Means Equal: Why the Time for the ERA is Now. In September 2018, she was appointed by Hunter College as Distinguished Lecturer and Rita E. Hauser, Director of the Human Rights Program at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. So now I will turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming out tonight, and welcome to our very distinguished panel. This is a very exciting moment, I think, for New York State with regard to the Equal Rights Amendment. But I'm going to just start with a few words, just for background, about my history with the early days of the State Equal Rights Amendment and the Federal Equal Rights Amendment. As most of you probably know, the Equal Rights Amendment was passed by Congress in 1972 by both houses and sent to the states for ratification with a deadline of 7 years, which was then extended to 1982, by which time only 35 states out of the 38 required had voted to ratify. It kind of stopped in its tracks at that point, although many people individually in many states kept going. And one of those people in Congress was Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who introduced it faithfully every year and tried to move it forward without much success. And in 2014, I was recruited by her to start the ERA Coalition because I think she realized we need a grassroots constituency. I'm getting people to sign on to this thing, but it's not moving forward anywhere. And we need people to hear from their voters that it's something they care about, and asked me to start what became the ERA Coalition. And I wrote that book, but it's completely outdated now, I'm very happy to say, because at that time, Congressman Maloney was introducing a new Equal Rights Amendment every year. It was called the Start Over ERA, but then in 2017, Nevada voted to ratify the ERA, although the deadline had long expired. And they were followed by Illinois in 2018 and Virginia in 2020. And suddenly we had 38 states, which is the constitutional requirement for an amendment. So we're closer than we've ever been. And we all kind of switched into this mode of just pushing it across the finish line, which is where we are now. And I won't bore you with all the procedural details, except to say there's legislation currently pending in Congress to remove the deadline formally and recognize the ratifications and effectively the amendment. We have 52 votes in the Senate, but we don't have 60. So We got stuck there, although there was a vote called last year, and we're just a few votes short of a discharge petition in the House. And 3 or 4 more Republicans will put that across the finish line. The New York delegation alone could make that happen. So that's where we are. And during this whole process, I became aware of the New York State interest in an equal rights amendment when we started drafting a new federal ERA, because, as I mentioned, Carla Maloney was thinking we have to start over because we thought the deadline really would preclude 3 more states from ratifying, which it ended up not doing. And we started to think, well, if you're going to start all over, shouldn't we look at the text and maybe make it broader? Because so much has happened since 1972. And we had a workshop here in New York at Columbia Law School with a number of experts, including Kim Crenshaw, Catherine McKinnon, and they came up with a really, really interesting equal rights amendment, which they wrote about in the Yale Law Journal. So I'll just recommend that article if you're interested, called "Reconstituting the Future Inequality Amendment." And it's really pretty radically progressive, far away from where our Congress is, but maybe closer to where New York State could be. And at that time, we became aware of the New York State effort. I think it was, well, certainly it was Liz Krueger at that time, and Evan Davis of Cleary Gottlieb, and others, and Catherine was in that process. So that was sort of my early days, which is really where I stopped. That was a number of years ago. And now here we are with a greatly expanded ERA that's passed the legislature twice and is about to go to a final referendum vote in November. And I think this ERA is going to be a fantastic model for the rest of the country. And this is a great opportunity tonight for us to learn more about it. So we're very lucky to have the kind of key players with us, and I want to congratulate them on all that they've done to get us to where we are in this very final step of a very long process. So I'm going to introduce them briefly. We have on the left Senator Liz Krueger, the sponsor of the bill in the Senate and a great champion in general of women's rights in all of her work. Catherine Boddy from the New York Civil Liberties Union, who specializes in gender equality and reproductive rights, and as I mentioned, has been involved in the drafting of this ERA from its early days. And Sasha Ahuja, the campaign director for New Yorkers for Equal Rights, which is a ballot initiative committee working for the ERA, which is now Prop 1 on the ballot. And Sasha came to this work after serving as national director of strategic partnerships for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. So I'm going to take about 45 minutes and ask these experts a number of questions to give us an introduction to this ERA. And let me get out my questions. And then we can have your questions and see where we are. So let me start by asking Liz and Catherine to tell us a little more about the history of this amendment and how it came to be. Do you want to start, Liz?
Sure, thank you very much. So, I think basically the law one should know about in life is there are no original ideas. And when you start to work on something, you quickly discover other people also had similar ideas and have been going down similar or different paths. And then you, if you're lucky, you get to meet them and then work with them all. So that's been my privilege now for 24 years in the state Senate, to get to meet and work with the really smart people on lots of issues. So, as was just told, we all know about the federal ERA. And when I started looking into, women aren't even mentioned in the New York State Constitution. Really? That's true. Oh, sorry. Oh, you did tell me to check. Okay, hi again, Liz Krueger. Not that smart. So when I started looking into what did we need to do to modernize the New York State Constitution, because we also didn't explain in our Constitution that women had equal rights in our Constitution, as we know we didn't have in the national Constitution. I started looking down the road at what had happened at the federal level, why it took so long, recognizing it does take a really long time to sometimes do things you think won't be that hard. And so I thought, starting in around 2019 in New York State, coming off of Another little project that took me 10 years to get past, the New York State Reproductive Health Act, which we only got it passed when the Democrats, I'll be partisan here, took the majority, oddly thanks to Donald Trump, because the 2018 elections, everybody went out in New York State and voted for Democrats. And so the New York State Senate suddenly went from Republican majority, and the Republicans hadn't wanted to touch reproductive health, voter rights, gender issues, or lots of other issues since like 1939, literally, because they'd sort of controlled the Senate since 1939. So we took over on our second day in power. Our first day was Voting Rights Day. We passed all these important voting rights laws. And the second day, we passed the bill I had worked on for 10 years, Reproductive Health Act, which basically put into statute protections many of us thought we must have because we had Roe v. Wade, but we didn't actually have those protections in New York State. And we had a lot of problems with abortion rights all those years. So we passed that bill, and then quickly after started looking at why do we have so few rights and protections on lots of really important issues, and they need to be put into our Constitution. So we started with looking at women, and then of course we immediately said, well, if it takes 50 years to get these things changed, we're not going to just start with women in 2019 in the great blue state of New York. Let's open up that section of the Constitution, which I don't think had been opened up since the 1930s, and really look at what it says, which is that you can't discriminate based on race, religion, and creed. And I still don't know what creed means, just for the record. And say, well, what else should we make sure we have as constitutional protections from discrimination? And so from there, it went into like a 5-year process with endless meetings, with endless experts, but most importantly, with the person sitting next to me, Catherine Bodie, who must have been at, am I exaggerating, 100 meetings on this issue over 5 years? I'm not exaggerating, right? Like 100 meetings about, well, what if we say this? Well, what about that? And I'm not a lawyer, by the way, all you lawyers. So they kept talking about court precedents. And I was like, what is court precedent stuff? I'm a legislator. Like, no, you can't put something in the Constitution that's going to put you up against XYZ court precedents. And constitutions really only matter when you're going to court. So we need to talk to lawyers who end up in court on discrimination issues in order to make sure that if we're going to go through all the hard work, and it's a lot of work, to change our Constitution and modernize it, that we are actually coming up with as broad and broadly interpretable by courts in the future constitutional rights and protections against discrimination. And so it kept growing. And then there would be other people who would show up and go, but what about us? Oh, yeah, what about you? Yeah, you should have equal rights under the Constitution. So, okay, let's figure out how to put that language in. And then something else, and somebody would come in and go, well, there was this horrendous court case in blah, blah, blah county in blah, blah, blah year. Catherine knows this all, I don't. And now we have to be really careful that our constitutional language will address why that precedent shouldn't stand anymore, because now we'll have these protections in the Constitution. And I faced for years and years, and I still do right now, well, can't you people just pass the right laws? What do we need a Constitution to spell this all out? And so I just will jump to the end for a second, why it is so important that we have this language in our Constitution. Because I sat in a Republican Senate for 17 years as a senator before I finally got a secure majority and we could actually pass good laws, in my opinion. And we could lose those elections any day now, possibly. And we could end up with a governor who didn't actually support equal rights for everyone. Just for the record, in the last election, she only held on by 3% against a Trump Republican who is anti-choice. I never asked him specifically about gender issues, but I'm going to guess he isn't so good on those either. So we only came within 3% of losing the governor's house to someone who does not share these views. And it's frankly pretty easy to overturn statutes with new legislative bodies or through executive orders or through just not having state agencies who follow your law because you don't like that law. Somebody else passed that. It's a lot harder to do that when it's in the Constitution because you have things called courts and judges and precedents. And so that's why I knew this was going to be a much bigger assignment than I originally thought it was going to be. Didn't know it would take 5 years, but partly it was because of the changes at the federal level with the overturning of Roe with the Dobbs decision, and suddenly everybody going, whoa, we really have to up the ante on making sure our Constitution makes it extremely clear, regardless of that Supreme Court down in Washington, what equal rights and protections from discrimination mean here in New York State. And so it was the kick in the pants that I think helped us get this over the hump through two houses, the Assembly and the Senate, during two different sessions, because that's how you change our Constitution. You have to go through both houses, Senate and Assembly, not once, but twice over a 4-year period, because it has to be two different sessions of the legislature. And then it comes to the people to vote it up or down in a ballot initiative. So it isn't easy to change a constitution, I think with intention, although it's quite irritating since I would have lots of changes to the Constitution. So it took us a long time to get to this place, but it also, I think, educated those of us who were working on it in the legislature to how many scenarios are out there in real life for real people that are actually going the wrong way in the courts of New York State because we don't have these constitutional protections. And what I don't think I have to do probably here in the Bar Association of New York City in 2024 is explain, Supreme Courts can get really, really scary. And they can pull things out from under you overnight that you never imagined would happen. And state capitals can be really scary places that hold enormous power over the decision making, literally, of our lives on a day-to-day basis. And we're seeing that now throughout the states of this country. And we're also seeing good news, other states working to change their constitutions. But people, I'm afraid, voters don't necessarily see why this affects them on a day-to-day basis. But hopefully in a room full of attorneys, you do understand why this can affect their lives on a day-to-day basis. And with that, my technical and legal expert, she actually works for this other company. I think it's called the New York Civil Liberties Union, but I just like to think of her as my lawyer.
I appreciate that. I don't know if I have too much to add to the history. It has been a real journey. And we certainly contacted experts from across the country to turn inside and out. Questions around what was protected in the New York State Constitution and what should be protected in the New York State Constitution. And so, it is. It's been a pleasure to do that thinking, and it's super exciting to be here at this point.
Well, Catherine, maybe you could just tell us a little more about the legal angles here that were referred to. Maybe what are some of those scenarios? Why is the ERA important for us?
Absolutely. So Prop 1, what you will see at the top of the back of your ballot, is an amendment to the New York State's Equal Protection Clause and Civil Rights Clause. That is Section 11 of the New York State Constitution. And what we are doing is we are adding protections for people, for New Yorkers, within our state's equal protection framework. And we are doing so in a way, Senator Krueger mentioned that our state equal protection clause only explicitly has protections against discrimination for race and religion. Creed is actually interpreted as religion.
So duplicative. Okay.
And so what we are doing is we are adding explicit protections for classes of national origin, ethnicity, disability, age, and sex. And we are really importantly clarifying the parameters of sex discrimination within our state constitution to include pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes, sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, along with reproductive health care and autonomy. And that is critical because the case law that has interpreted Section 11 has pinned our state constitutional protections to our federal constitutional protections. And we are all very aware of the way in which federal constitutional protections, in particular equality protections, are being diminished in a number of different ways.
I mean, maybe what I should do is just read you that key part. I think it's always helpful to actually hear the language because it is so, I think, pretty comprehensive, and it protects. It says no person shall be denied the equal protection of the laws of the state or any subdivision thereof because of race, color, ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, creed or religion, or sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, pregnancy outcomes, and reproductive health care and autonomy. It's a really impressive list, I think. And one other thing I would just point out, not to jump in on your panel, but there's a very interesting section. Maybe you can talk about Section B and what that provision is. Shall I read it? Would that?
Yeah, perhaps.
Nothing in this section shall invalidate or prevent the adoption of any law, regulation, program, or practice designed to prevent or dismantle discrimination on the basis of a characteristic listed in this section. Nor shall any characteristic listed in this section be interpreted to interfere with, limit, or deny the civil rights of any person based upon any other characteristic identified in this section. I found that a particularly interesting, unusual provision.
I'm happy to speak to Section B. I think we are having a conversation about equality in this country, and in particular within our courts, about whether or not our laws and policies should take into account the historical context and social context of discrimination. And what we are seeing, and this is a thread of equal protection jurisprudence, is that courts are increasingly denying our government's ability to redress discrimination by acknowledging that we need to be supporting certain communities and classes of people. And that means that we are essentially taking away the ability of the government to create programs that support in actually redressing discrimination, as I said. A good example of this is affirmative action. And so we wanted to make sure that it was important in our New York State Constitution that we were acknowledging that the legislature can and should take into account the impact of law and policy when designing it.
So, Sasha, you have the challenging job of explaining all this to the public.
Yes.
And getting them to understand it and support it. How do you do that, and how's it going?
Oh my gosh, $1 million question. Okay, my friends, you ready? Buckle up. We are 42 days away from the election. 6 weeks, that's all we have. And there's a lot going on. Every time I open the news, there's this and there's that and there's national and there's battlegrounds and there's congressionals and there is everything else going on. I think voters feel quite overwhelmed in this moment. And I think sometimes in the state of New York, we take our rights for granted. And we think that, of course, New Yorkers support equal rights. And of course, New Yorkers support protecting abortion and reproductive freedom. We have learned the hard way here in the state of New York. When we have taken fights for granted, we have lost or come really, really close to losing these fights. So also thanks to the leadership of our state legislature, in 2021, I'll take us back for a moment, we had important voting rights and democracy measures on the ballot here in the state of New York. Now, Senator Krueger explained that it's quite difficult to change our state constitution. We're not a state that oftentimes brings issues to voters, nor are we a state that organizes campaigns around how to then vote on those issues when they appear on the ballot. And in 2021, when we had voting rights and democracy measures on the ballot, we took the fight for granted. We said, of course, New Yorkers are going to support voting rights and a more fair redistricting process, and we lost that fight. Those of us who support voting rights, which I believe are many people in this room, we did not stand up a campaign to tell New York voters how to vote. We just kind of dropped the ball. And even here in the city, which is where I live and where I vote, 30% of voters in the city left the question blank. They didn't even vote on those ballot questions. Now, it was not the highest turnout election in 2021 in November, but it was such a critical moment and demonstrated that when we take these fights for granted, we can lose them. The senator also mentioned in 2022, we came very, very close to an anti-abortion extremist taking the governor's mansion, and that surprised a lot of folks all over the country. The red wave didn't show up in many, many states, but it certainly showed up here, and we have seen a significant political shift in the state of New York. And so now enter this really important election year. Certainly, there is lots of conversation at the top of the ticket, and really, really important races all across the state. Lots of things that people are thinking about when they're showing up to vote, candidates certainly that are talking about our issues. We have the unique opportunity in waging a fight on the issues that are appearing on the ballot to stay actually out of that partisan fray. We can talk to New Yorkers about their lives and their bodies and their futures and communicate the very complex set of things you heard from Senator Krueger and Catherine to everyday people and reminding them about the stakes in this election. So what we did, as soon as we knew affirmatively that Prop 1, or we now are calling Prop 1, will appear on the ballot, we brought together an incredible coalition of organizations all across the state. Organizations that have reach and have members and have supporters and people who trust them. Organizations like the New York Civil Liberties Union and Planned Parenthood, labor unions across the state like 1199, 32BJ, the teachers union in our state, civil rights groups like NAACP, and local and grassroots organizations all across the state. We've built a coalition of over 500 organizations in the state of New York that every day of the week are knocking on doors, talking to voters about how important it is to flip their ballot and vote yes on Prop 1. We're actually doing something quite different than what's been done historically on ballot measures. If you vote in the state of New York, may not have had anyone ever communicate with you about a measure on the ballot. You may show up surprised, as informed as we may be, that there are measures on the ballot to begin with. And so we knew that, and we knew we needed to work twice as hard and make sure that we can communicate really, really clearly to New York voters that it is essential that we pass Prop 1 this November. Now, how we do that is bringing people back to that moment when Roe fell. We need to remind people of what that felt like as a New Yorker. Reminding folks that all of a sudden, although many of us predicted that moment, but all of a sudden, a lot of folks realized on that day in late June that our rights were not as protected and as permanently protected as we thought they were. We have to bring folks back to that moment and talk to them about the very simple fact that New Yorkers deserve the ability to control their lives, their bodies, and their futures, not politicians. And reminding people the simple thing that they can do, no matter how they're voting or who they're voting for or issues that they care about, all they need to do is flip their ballot and vote yes. And we have the benefit of an incredible coalition to get the job done. It has not been easy. A lot of people still don't know that Prop 1 is on the ballot, but the reality is that many, many people are just tuning in. I think about the election every day, but many people are just tuning in to what's happening. Certainly, of course, they may be paying attention to the top of the ticket, but those races down ballot, folks are just like, who am I voting for again? Am I voting for Senator Krueger? Am I voting for somebody else? They're remembering all the other fights that are on the ballot. And so in many ways, we've built the entire infrastructure, and the work that will scale is happening right on time. We're going to be in your mailbox, on all of the social media and things that you consume, and then up on TV later, much closer to the election, to make sure that we can communicate to voters about what Prop 1 is and what it does and how to make sure we educate folks so that turn out, flip their ballot, and vote yes.
Sounds great.
Great.
Lot to do in a short
Lots to
time.
do. Yes.
But let's go back to just a little bit to the sort of legal and political questions about the ERA. In particular, I'm going to throw a few of these questions together in the interest of time. I guess one question that maybe comes up is, do we already have these rights in New York? Why do we need this? And then also, how is this different from federal constitutional protections than we have? I don't know if you want to take that, Liz.
So people think they have. Thank you. You got it. People often think they have rights that they don't have because they just assume this is the great state of New York. Of course they'd have these rights. And we have a good human rights law. We don't have adequate resources to respond to all of the cases brought to them, just FYI. It's another issue. of actually, do you have a right if there's no enforcement of it? And that's a real problem with just having laws. And again, when you go into a court case to make sure that you win the argument that you were discriminated against, if you don't have a constitutional basis, that law gets taken a look at by the judge who says it's not a constitutional law. I've been a legislator for 24 years, and I still have to explain sometimes to my colleagues. They go, well, we passed it as a law, so it must be. I go, well, it must be until somebody challenges us in court and it's declared unconstitutional. That happens all the time. Really? Why don't we know about it? Because we're not in the case. Nobody actually sends us every legal decision and goes, yo, Liz, that bill you thought you passed in 2015, it was found unconstitutional. I still don't know to this day how I would go find that out, by the way. I guess Catherine could help me now. I'm curious how many of the laws I have happily and proudly passed and gotten into law have actually already been thrown out in a court and I don't even know about it. And I should be one of the ones who knows those kinds of things, right? So the people don't know that. So having a law or having just the belief that, of course, especially those of us who live in New York City, and I don't know how many of us have spent time in other parts of the state, we're living in a ghetto. It's called New York City. We fight over who's liberal enough here. We fight over, I actually once got involved in a political fight between a couple of people who actually used as their argument that one was more lesbian than another, and therefore they should win. And I was like, yeah, this isn't really why I went into politics. And I don't know how you make that judgment call anyway. So we live in a ghetto. So we don't even understand that much of the state, better yet, much of the country, not everybody has the same views waking up in the morning that most of us in New York City actually do have. So we make assumptions of protections we have that we don't really have. And then some of us are lawyers and we end up in court cases where we think we have protections, then we discover we lose the case because a judge who we have to, I guess, assume knows how to read the Constitution has decided you don't have a constitutional protection, so that law doesn't stand up. And now we're living in a world where we see that at the federal level, and I'm going to really hand it to Catherine here, the federal level, you really can't count on them, even though it does worry me that ultimately they supersede anything we can do here in New York. So we can try the best we can to build the protections that we ought to all have into our Constitution. But then when Bev jumped to, and what do we do in relationship to the federal courts and federal law? So I'm now going to hand it to Ms. Bodie.
Geez, where to pick up on that? I would say that we are taking the opportunity to clarify and constitutionalize rights within the New York State Constitution. As I mentioned earlier, our Section 11 of our state constitution is pinned to federal Equal Protection Clause jurisprudence and protections. And what that means is that our state constitution does not adequately protect people based on, for instance, sex. And it is very important that we actually include protections for sex discrimination within our within our state constitution, but also that we clarify the parameters of what sex discrimination means. In the 1970s, the Supreme Court held that in the Godaldig case, that pregnancy discrimination was not sex discrimination. And as I think absurd as that result is, that has translated into our own state law. And so we are taking the opportunity to clarify the boundaries of some of these protections, including sex discrimination, and to embed protections for abortion within our state constitution. And that is really critical.
And I guess digging deep into my memories here, but one of the questions I think Liz referred to is how do people enforce their rights, right? And if I recall it seems and also the power of the courts to undo things like protections. And I vaguely remember that there was a court case on the New York State Constitution that in some ways it validated all of that protection, not only that there was no sex, but even race and religion, because it wasn't that accessible in terms of enforcement. I don't know if I'm right about that, but Catherine, how will people be able to enforce their rights under this ERA?
Yeah, the court cases that have interpreted Section 11 have found that when applied to private action, that there needs to be some kind of legislative action. So that the text of Section 11, even though on its face it applies to both public and private actors, that there needs to be some kind of law or policy passed in order to make those rights executing against private actors. However, the legislature made clear when passing the Equal Rights Amendment that this was self-executing against government action. And that means that people can go directly to court to vindicate their rights when the government passes a law or a policy or takes some type of prosecutorial action, et cetera. When the government has some kind of action that discriminates against people on these bases, the people can go straight to court to vindicate their rights.
Thank you. So let's go back to the campaign, and let me ask all of you to share with us so far what have been the greatest challenges. Sasha, let's start with you.
Sure. So urgency is our biggest enemy in this campaign. As the senator said, folks already feel like we have these protections in place. And New Yorkers, I know we love us. We think that we're smart and smarter than anyone else who lives in any other state. We are just taking, it's been our experience so far that New Yorkers just don't feel the urgency. They don't feel the acute threat of a national abortion ban or even a state level abortion ban. If we tell folks that over the last decade, there have been 53 pieces of legislation that have moved through the state legislature to roll back access to reproductive health, they're like, what are you talking about? What do you mean New York would ever ban abortion or roll back rights? But as we know, courts have made many decisions, both here in New York State and all across the country, that remind us that the threat is at our doorstep and could come to our homes and to our communities at any time. And so really raising the urgency for folks has been among our more challenging issues on this campaign. Separately, we're doing something really big. So New York is one of 10 states that's putting abortion on the ballot. Of course, here in New York, we're taking a bigger and bolder approach. There are really, really important defensive fights to restore access to abortion in states like Florida, which has a 6-week abortion ban in place, and a gigantic campaign to try to restore access in the state of Florida. In Arizona, in Nebraska, in Nevada, in Montana, in states that the stakes are really high for basic access to healthcare. New York is one of 3 states that's putting what we're calling sort of these proactive measures on the ballot. So New York, Colorado, and Maryland are putting measures on the ballot similarly to protect and make sure we're securing access to reproductive health care, and then in the case in New York, reproductive health care and beyond in our state constitutions. And the way in which the language has been written has also become fodder for the opposition. As folks know, and you may have seen the ballot language already, we're making it really explicit that we're protecting people on the basis of gender, gender identity, gender expression. And the opposition has waged their fight and dug into the culture wars of 2024 and really dove into their agenda of weaponizing the lives of LGBT young people, especially. And we've seen how these fights have played out in our state, including right here in Nassau County. They're trying to drive a wedge into our communities and try to divide and distract New Yorkers from what Prop 1 is all about. Those messages from the opposition are powerful. And so when we talk to New Yorkers, if Election Day were tomorrow, we'd be feeling pretty good. 64% of New Yorkers would support us if there was no communication and no education about what Prop 1 is, just simply seeing the ballot language. Folks are with us. But if they hear from the opposition, and if the opposition's message gets out, if the opposition can get up on TV and get up into your social media feeds, and if their arguments can be in the local papers and they can reach folks, those opposition claims can be very, very powerful, and it can peel our base away. And so our job through this campaign is to make sure that we, through the coalition and the infrastructure that we've built, can both get out in front of the opposition and have the ability to respond to the opposition if they're trying to divide and distract New Yorkers from what Prop 1 is about. This is a real fight. The opposition attacks, as I mentioned, are not only powerful, but people drop in their support. And so we're doing everything possible to make sure we're raising all the resources, talking to voters directly, engaging folks in all the organizing that we're doing all across the state, not just downstate, but in every part of the state to reach every single voter and talk to them about their issues, talk to them about their bodies, their lives, their futures, and what it takes to make sure that we have to have the strongest possible protections in our state constitution. That's our job, to make sure that we're doing that. We built this campaign a year ago knowing that this would be a real fight. And we're sort of, it's a long and short time until Election Day. There's a lot that's going to move in the next 42 days. And of course, lots of opportunities for folks in this room to plug into the work in the final stretch.
It's interesting because the real money behind the opposition is anti-choice money. Oh, I am just not good at this. Thank you. The real money behind the opposition to Prop 1 is all anti-choice money.
That's right.
But they actually know we're not an anti-choice state, and that's not a really good strategy. So they're hiding the fact that it's really a vote against abortion by voting no. So they're telling you all kinds of things out there. My favorite recent one is, because they are using the culture wars and the word transgender and the concept of transgender. So I had somebody who recently said to me, so they're going to take my child during the school day and force them to have transgender surgery, and they'll come home a different sex. I said, we're still working on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Do we really think our schools are going to actually be taking children and performing surgery on them during the day? Like, think about it. That's like, no matter what the facts are, and the facts are no, that couldn't possibly be true, and that would be against the law, a whole series of laws, but also would be just, absurd. So they just keep sending, then we have the messages, we won't have girls' sports teams at schools anymore. Well, yes, we will. And that's actually federal law, by the way. Not that I don't think anyone in New York State wants to end girls' sports in our school system. I'm pretty sure nobody does. So that's also not true. Then I've had people say, if you can't discriminate, that means you can't have special discounts for older New Yorkers. And I'm an older New Yorker, and I like my half fare on the MTA, or I like my discount under the SCREE or DREE program if you're a renter in New York City. And we won't be able to do that anymore? It's like, no, you still fundamentally have the ability as government to make laws with good public policy reasons. So yes, this would not impact taking away specific benefits that people might or might not have depending on age or disability. I love the one, people in wheelchairs will want to be firefighters. And I've worked for many, many years on many issues with this amazing man who used to be the head of this bar association, Evan Davis, who's also been in a wheelchair most of his life, I believe. And I remember Evan saying to me when we were working on the disability section of this amendment, he goes, no, I'm pretty sure to be a firefighter, the test is, can you carry 50 pounds on your back and climb up 4 flights of stairs fast? And I'm guessing we're not going to find anybody who's wheelchair bound actually able to pass that physical requirement test. So no, we won't have a requirement that people must be firefighters regardless of their ability to do the job. And so they keep coming up with all of these really strange things. And yet some people go, oh, that's all scary sounding. And what are we talking about? And then much more simply, people don't know to turn over the ballot.
Right.
I mean, from the day one, I said, just have a campaign that says, turn the ballot over. Because as Bev actually said, most people, if they read the bill, the language, even though we wanted much simpler language and we should have gotten it, will read it and go, oh yeah, that sounds like a yes. So you have the other responsibility as a voter to understand not only are you dealing with everyone on the front of your ballot, and if you live in my district, yes, please vote for me. and I don't remember my opponent's name. Sorry, so you could still vote for him. I just don't know his name. But you have to turn the ballot over, and then it's going to be a little more confusing because there are 5 other props, and those are related to the New York City Charter, not the state constitution. And there's a whole universe of people who I think I actually agree with who are running a campaign vote no on those. So it's like, oh my God, now we have a campaign saying vote no on the propositions on the back of the ballot. And people are going to go, wait, did people tell me not to vote on the back of the ballot or to vote no? So it's actually, it's yes on one, and you figure out what the other 5 mean because I can't figure them out, and you decide whether you're going to vote for them or not.
Right.
But it makes it really much more complicated walking into the election.
I think I lost the thread on the question, but I think it was the challenges. 100% what Sasha and Senator Krueger said. I think one of the challenges, maybe it's more of a personal challenge for me as a person who was really engaged in the conversation from the beginning and really wanted this to be an amendment that inspires other people, has been a lot of pushback actually from within our own circles, asking why we aren't just putting abortion in the New York State Constitution.
That's right.
And that to me is a question that I want to flip on its head, because in the wake of Dobbs, I think that state advocates have an opportunity to protect abortion rights within our state constitutions, maybe an obligation to protect abortion rights within our state constitutions. And certainly some states have chosen to move forward in an abortion rights only framework. We in New York State are doing something different. We are acknowledging that abortion and limitations on abortion are a symptom of sex discrimination. And that is something that has been totally peeled apart and separate within our federal case law since Griswold in 1965. And so what we are doing is acknowledging what abortion means in people's lives. And also something bigger than that. We are not leaving members of our community behind when we open up New York State's Equal Protection Clause. And so I find that inspiring, and I hope that you all do too.
Do you want to say anything more about some of the misinformation that's out there?
Well, I think Senator
go ahead.
Krueger said it. I mean, the money that is going behind the opposition campaign is anti-abortion money. The funders for that fight are anti-abortion extremists. But they're not talking about abortion. They're talking about everything else. And so we need to be clear and define exactly who the opposition is. People who don't want to protect our rights and certainly don't want to protect abortion rights in our state. That's who they are. They've made it clear they're parroting their narratives around, and we know exactly where their money comes from. And so it's part of our job also to define the opposition, to call out their lies and misinformation, and be rigorous in doing that, and not peel away and not hide behind these protections, but make sure that we're communicating to voters that these folks are trying to take advantage of you. They're turning children into their political pawns. They're trying to sell lies and misinformation to divide and distract you. That's sort of our orientation in terms of how we're talking about the opposition, if we're elevating what they're saying at all.
Let me just invite you to write questions on your cards, because we really want to get to as many of those as we can, and I think someone will collect them from you. But I just have to comment, it's on the one hand, we have all these issues, and then on the other hand, it's this simple thing of like turn over the page and read what you're voting for or against. And I don't know if there's any special ways to really reach people on some of those practical things so that they don't make those mistakes. And more generally, Sasha, I mean, how can people help to really spread the word? What kind of campaign materials are you thinking about?
So glad you asked. How can we help? Awesome. So as we said, there are 6 weeks left until the election. If you would like to join us in this fight to help pass Prop 1, we have lots of lovely campaign materials in this room, in the front row. And you can join our fight by going to Yes on Prop 1 NY. That's the number one. Yes on Prop 1, the number one NY.org. You can organize with us. You can phone bank. You can knock on doors. You can join us at a canvassing event. We have a number of events coming up. Organizing calls focus on key constituencies, organizing calls with Black women, with Latinas across the state, really elevating the fight for healthcare providers and making sure we're talking to folks who are providing healthcare in more rural parts of the state. And in the final weeks, doing everything possible to get out the vote, to ensure that we are encouraging our folks, in spite of maybe more energy around this election in the last 6 weeks. The reality in New York is that the needle hasn't really shifted. Folks don't necessarily feel more motivated to turn out to vote. And so we need to remind them. What we do know is when we talk to people about issues and we educate New York voters about Prop 1, especially voters of color, especially young people, especially students, especially people who are impacted by the protections of Prop 1. When folks know that Prop 1 is on the ballot, they're more motivated to vote. And so if you want to get involved and get in the fight, you can grab some great material. Our colleagues are handing out some very helpful one-pagers, and join us in the fight. The time is short. We don't need a ton of it, but we're going to need everyone possible to get the job done.
Thank you. I mean, I'm thinking about what Catherine said on abortion. I wasn't aware of the idea that even in our own community, maybe people felt like, I think what you said is we should be focusing only on abortion, like some of the other states. And I think early on in the campaign, if I recall correctly, there was a kind of a division too about should we just have sex. Remember, it was should we just add sex to this language? And we ended up with something much broader. And I think the thinking was, that's who we are. We really want equality for all people. And I, as someone who was born in New York and very loyal to New York, really hope that is who we are. And I think we want to show the rest of the country that that's who we are and encourage them to be that way as well. So with that, I want to just maybe open it up for questions. I don't know if we have questions yet, or you have cards?
We're still collecting.
Oh, okay.
Can you give her some? So we
Yeah,
can
I could
start?
take some. Want me to take some? We could, because we could have time for questions. Oh, there's quite a lot. Okay. Okay. Well, let me try this one. Can you talk a bit about the controversy over the ballot language? We mentioned that in passing, but I actually think many people don't know what that is.
So, constitutional language is never simple English. I don't know how many of you take it to bed at night and read it, but it's not like a good novel. I mean, it's very technical, and sometimes it's words I still don't even understand, and it was written over different decades and different generations, and so it's not simple English. We knew that the ballot initiative we wanted to have, the language for the Constitution wasn't going to be simple English. So we passed another bill also, which requires, we think, that ballot language has to be simple English. And we passed that bill both with this amendment in mind and based on the experience of the last set of amendments on voter rights that did not pass. And one, nobody told people, remember, this is about voter rights, turn over your ballot. And two, people didn't understand what it said. So the legislature went through the process of passing a law that says the Board of Election, which is made out of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, not an ideal situation for dealing with controversy, that they have to come up with language that meets an 8th grade reading level. And it has to be defined as simple English. The Board of Elections flunked their own test. The language they offered in draft and then signed off on it as final, it was a grade 15 reading level. That's not grade 8. And they said we couldn't do any better. And it's true, the law we passed in the legislature said as close as you can get to 8th grade reading level. But they said, well, 15th grade is as close as we can get. And then a bunch of us, including the Attorney General for the state of New York, drafted our own language and submitted to them and said, no, here, this is 8th grade. I sent them a letter signed by like most of the senators and assembly members saying, no, this language meets 8th grade and is understandable. You could use that. The Attorney General had somewhat different language. I was happy with her language too. It met 8th grade reading level. But the Board of Elections, because the 2 Democrats and the 2 Republicans couldn't agree, said, yeah, never mind, we're not doing that. We're going to flunk that law. And so we got not. Is there a band? A protest? Oh, I hope not us, but you never know.
Not part of the campaign.
Pardon me?
It's not part of the campaign.
Okay, fine. It wasn't us? Okay. Sorry. So they couldn't agree, and so they gave us this really bad language that's actually in violation, we believe, of the law we passed. And then there was a court case, and I'm not quite sure what the judge decided. I mean, we know the judge accepted the board's decision, but I don't even know if the judge ever commented on the fact that it flunked the state law for simple and understandable English. So we have bad language. And so I get a lot of people telling me, well, you're too stupid to put the word abortion in. It's like, no, this went through endless constitutional attorneys, endless years. And I figured that would be farther east tonight, but whatever. So we lost, and we lost in court, and I guess there was no opportunity to appeal. I don't even know that part of the story.
Yeah, so there was a voter. So the plain language statute that Senator Krueger is speaking to sets out a whole process by which the AG needs to recommend ballot language to the Board of Elections, and the Board of Elections should take that into account and propose language, and then a public comment period opens. And what we saw is 1,500 comments pour into the Board of Elections, saying that the language that they put out was not clear, that people really needed to see language that it included abortion rights, that it captured members of our community, such as our LGBT members of our community. And the Board of Elections, in a meeting to discuss the language, spent about 5 minutes in talking about the comments, and then passed on changing their initial proposal and finalized it as was. There was a voter challenge to that language, and ultimately the court held, after looking at the back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans and the BOE, that they really did make what the standard in the law was, best efforts to reach an 8th grade reading level. I think that we certainly disagree with where that case landed, but it makes our job all the more important to get out and educate voters and tell them who this captures and what this means for New Yorkers.
Great, thank you. Lots of great questions. I'm trying to sort of sort them so that we can put some together. Here's a tough one, I'm afraid. I hope I'm wrong about the answer here. Does Prop 1 provide any protections if a federal abortion ban were passed?
In our system of federal supremacy, there is nothing that New York State can do short of civil disobedience if a federal constitutional or statutory abortion ban passes.
That's what I thought. Okay. Here are 2 questions. In 2020, when the ballot referendum on voting rights and fixing the IRC failed, the Republican and Conservative parties spent $3.5 million on a campaign against these ballot measures, and the New York Democratic Party spent nothing in support of them. Is the state Democratic Party supporting Prop 1? And a related question is, what is the state Democratic Party and Governor Hochul doing to support the passage of Prop 1?
I can take that. Okay. Yes, so our friends have learned some hard lessons. And yes, while we as a ballot initiative committee cannot coordinate with any individual or candidate running for office, people who are running for office, including Democrats, will be talking about Prop 1, which we're thrilled about. We, as a ballot initiative committee, can tell them how to talk about Prop 1 and all the things that we've learned in our research, which we are doing. And so we, as a ballot initiative committee, in where we stand as New Yorkers for Equal Rights, can provide any individual with any level of information that they would like about how important it is to flip their ballot and vote yes on Prop 1. Just last week, the governor has made a financial commitment to support this effort, which is great. More is more in the money game in politics in New York. And so more is still needed to make sure that we can close our budget gap and raise the resources that we need. But yes, we do expect strong support from candidates who care deeply about abortion access and freedom and equality to be talking about and more is always needed.
So, and related to that question, are a few questions that you'll probably welcome on fundraising efforts. And are there any fundraisers coming up? And how
Yes,
can
oh
people
my gosh,
support?
people want to donate. Of course, you can go to our website, yes, on Prop 1, the number one, ny.org, and donate. And yes, we are hosting all sorts of events in the next 6 weeks to make sure that we can raise the funds necessary to win this fight. Fun thing about ballot initiatives, we can take money from anybody, and there are no contribution limits. And so if you're in a position to contribute directly, please go ahead and donate. And you can do so on our website.
Thanks. This is a quick one. Is there a threshold for passing Prop 1 above 50%, or is it just a simple majority? I guess Florida has a threshold of 60. Simple majority. Okay. An interesting question. In drafting the RA legislation, did you reach out to other states for guidance, strategy, collaboration, and perhaps even to strengthen their legislation?
Jessica, would you just repeat the
In drafting the bill, did you reach out to other states for guidance, strategy, collaboration on the one hand, but also to maybe give them some ideas to strengthen their legislation? How much interstate, if any, communication and coordination has there been?
Yeah. I mean, in the process of developing the language, we did some pretty extensive research and had a lot of conversations with advocates in other states and national advocates as well to understand the direction of equal protection jurisprudence and protections and how we can advance that in New York State. So there were certainly a lot of questions along those lines or conversations along those lines. I think I would just also say, and perhaps this is also in response to the question around a federal abortion ban, that I think that what we are doing in New York State is actually a model, certainly for a new day on the federal level, and I think it builds momentum towards that. But also, I think that we are already seeing states across the country take up the question of how to protect reproductive autonomy within a broader framework that recognizes the social impact of limitations on reproductive autonomy and healthcare within a sex equality framework. So those are really exciting conversations, and I think that doing this in New York the way we are is setting a model for the rest of the country.
And to Catherine's point, Minnesota and Oregon are looking at identical measures to put on their ballots in 2026. So not only what we're doing, but how we win this fight will be watched closely in states all across the country.
And
also, since Dodd's crapped out, so to speak, what legislators have been doing is a series of state laws that hopefully expand access to abortion, not just for those of us here in New York where we thought, oh, we had pretty good law, but in recognition of what was happening in states that put bans into effect and put limits. So I think we've passed at least 8 laws at the state level to, I looked at my staff person who works on this with me, that actually improve abilities for others to come to New York to get abortions if they cannot even get contraception in the state they live on. We've expanded telemedicine options. We've expanded a whole series of privacy rights for women who may need to travel across state lines. And we've been doing that in coordination with other states. So we've actually been able to meet some really great legislators from other states. And we literally just sit in conference Zooms and go, we're doing this on privacy rights. And then somebody will go, oh, we're working on one like that. And then we'll like immediately give each other our drafts and we'll go, oh, we really like that from Illinois. Oh, we really like that from Connecticut. Let's combine that. And then maybe some other states will come along and go, oh, yeah, that blended one is great. We'll just steal that one too. And I also see that as really important moving forward from a federal perspective because we don't want to have 50 different sets of laws on women's health and reproductive rights. That's ridiculous. We're forced into it for now, but let's hope we all gain our sanity again. And then we go, oh, look, 25 states have already passed almost identical increased protections for access to reproductive health care and rights. Let's take those really good states and just make that federal law because now we already have it in one place. And anybody who's ever tried to deal with national issues and realizes every state has a different set of law, it's not the way you want to do it. Sometimes you just have to do it that way. So I think we've ironically built a much stronger coalition of legislators around the country and advocates around the country trying to get us down one path to the right road. That's not great. Down the right road together. That's what I wanted to say.
And I know from those early days, at that time, it was about 26 states had equal rights amendments, and they were most of them were pretty much identical to the federal language. So I was interested to read. There's an article in the latest New York State Bar Association journal that says there are now 29 states, and talks about Nevada, which was the last state to adopt an equal rights provision, and it also seems very, very broad. It has sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, age, disability, ancestry, or national origin. So, so it's encouraging, especially since we don't know, we don't have federal protection, that at least states are trying to put state ERAs in place and increasingly with broader protections. There are a couple of questions about children and parental authority, so I'll just read those. What are the guardrails for minors? What are the safeguards for parental rights? There are active bills in our legislature, like A6761, that would grant any minor with no low age threshold rights to medical decisions without parental consent or notice. And another one, the proposal will amend the act to also protect against unequal treatment based on age. Do you believe that parents have rights to raise their children in accord with their beliefs and values? How will parental rights and therefore children be protected?
So the Equal Rights Amendment doesn't change anything. Boy, I'm really bad. The amendment doesn't change New York state law. Whether you like those proposed bills or hate those proposed bills, those are proposed bills from pre the amendment passing, and whether they passed or not wouldn't actually have anything to do with the amendment. So people get confused between what a legislature might take on for itself in changing law and what's the law already. So some of those, I don't know that bill specifically, so I'm not going to pretend to answer that question. But for example, and some people don't know this, in New York State, if you're a teenager and you want to get reproductive services, whether it's contraception, treatment for STDs, or an abortion, you don't need parental consent now. You don't. And thank goodness you don't, because we would have a lot more crises in the state for young people who found themselves with sexually transmitted diseases and couldn't get treatment because they couldn't go home and tell their parents that that was the situation. You'd see many more unwanted pregnancies because they couldn't get access to contraception. And you would see many more devastating stories of young people who decide that they can't carry a pregnancy, not being able to get the health care they needed. And so when I hear those kinds of questions, it makes me think, oh, it's not whether the legislature is going to go ahead and pass bills like this. It's, are young people getting the access to the health care they need now, regardless of whether they're in agreement or disagreement with their parents?
And frankly, we've had that approach on STDs and contraception and the right to abortion for 50 years. And nobody went screaming, they're taking our children from us and forcing them to make decisions that we wouldn't make for them. And it is true. I am quite sure there are young people who make decisions about their own sexuality and their own sexual activity that they are not in agreement with their parents. I'm going to suspect a bunch of us at certain ages in our lives were those people, just FYI, right? Who didn't discuss with mom and dad that they were going to go have their first sexual experience. It wasn't a dinner table conversation in advance. And it might not have been a dinner table conversation that they ended up with an STD, or that they ended up ending a pregnancy without discussing it with their parents, because that's actually in the best interest of public health and the health of those young people. And it's not even particularly surprising. So these kinds of questions, are just like, again, let's just throw it into the mix. As I said before, somebody's going to pass a law saying we're going to force your children into gender changing medical procedures or surgery without parental permission. No, we're not going to pass a law like that. And there isn't a law like that now, so it has nothing to do with this amendment.
I would just add to what Senator Krueger is saying. I think Senator Krueger is right on to acknowledge that New York State has long allowed minors who can provide informed consent. Confidential healthcare hinges on providing informed consent to consent to abortion care. That is based on really solid public policy reasoning, acknowledging that not all minors live in safe spaces, and we want to make sure that minors access the health care they need. Although we certainly recognize that minors involving, and most minors do involve some kind of trusted adult in their decision, that is, of course, the best outcome. When it comes to minors' ability to consent in New York State, the Prop 1 does not change the current legal scheme that requires minors to get parental consent for any type of procedural care. And I think that that's just important to underscore, that this isn't going to be some kind of sword that pierces that legal scheme. But I wanted to get to something else you said, Jessica, because the person also asked about the age protections within the state constitution. There have been a handful of other states that have also passed age protections as part of their equal rights amendment. Louisiana being one of them, and perhaps an apt example because there's been a significant amount of case law that have occurred under that. In fact, there was a challenge to the state's drinking law under attempting to say that the state imposing a drinking age was age discrimination. And the court made clear, as courts have across the country, and certainly I do not doubt that New York courts would continue to apply an analysis that acknowledged that minors are differently situated to constitutional rights, as has been the case for a very long time, and that the state still continues an ability to legislate and make rules for the public health and well-being. So again, this feels like it's following a line of arguments that the opposition is raising that have these types of absurd outcomes. And I think that we really want to be wary when those kinds of arguments are posed.
Okay, what classifications or language were considered but didn't make it into the final proposed amendment? I'm especially wondering about poverty, since the federal constitution doesn't consider it a suspect classification.
What was the word that?
Poverty. But generally, what didn't make it?
The conversations we were focused on
characteristics that you have no control over. So poverty, many people would actually argue, I would probably argue that for societal and economic reasons, there are people who live in poverty with no control over it, but it wasn't because you were born poor per se. Maybe if we had a caste system in this country, we could have made that argument, but I don't think that was even categorized. Although, if you look at another section of the Constitution, it does say that in New York State, we have an obligation to care for the needy, and that's been the basis of a whole series of litigation over the years about the right to shelter and the right to access to food and health care. But that's a different section.
Which is a perfect segue to another question. Since March 2024, excuse me, single adult migrants over age 23 have been limited to one 30-day shelter stay in New York City. If enacted, would Prop 1 invalidate this provision of the right to shelter as discrimination on the basis of national origin and age? Why or why not?
I'm really not prepared to answer these types of LSAT hypos. I will just say though that national origin and ethnicity are protected under the federal Equal Protection Clause. I don't think that we anticipate many shifts when it comes to the case law there. And I think one of the questions we get is certainly around the ability to change immigrants' ability to vote, for instance. We do not think that this provides a mechanism for changing recent immigrants' ability to vote, nor do we think that this in any way changes the federal government's ability to control who comes in and out of the country.
Okay, so I'm just going to end with this and give our panelists a chance to have a last word. And it's not a question, it's really more, I think, advice, which is how about publicizing the 500 organizations, the number of ERA states? People want to keep up. And my favorite argument of all, which I use a lot, is also these things haven't caused the sky to fall elsewhere. So so let me just end with that. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all the questions, but I did want to give our panelists a final word. Liz?
Well, first I want to thank the other women on this panel who, frankly, each and every one of them has been doing extraordinary work on trying to accomplish this goal, some for fewer years, some for longer years, and that it's been a real honor for me to have decided to take on this challenge. And it was a challenge, as it is to move many important pieces of legislation in Albany. So I have faith in the public that if they understand they're supposed to turn over the ballot and they take a look, they're going to vote yes. I really do believe that. And it does disturb me that people are just out and out lying about this over and over again. And now there are lawn signs in various counties, I believe, talking about like they're coming for your children, vote no. But that seems to unfortunately be part of the American political model at this point, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Oh, I did it again. You're going to have to fire me. There's a lot of political misinformation as almost the model of politics at this moment in this country that I think is just doing an enormous amount of harm, not only to the concept of democracy, but to all of us as people. So I guess I expected that this was going to go down this road because of where we are in this moment in history, where everything is going down this road of lies and deception, and just you tell a lie enough times, then people will somehow believe it. So hopefully you and anyone you can speak to and coordinate with between now and 6 weeks from now will know the truth about why it is so important to turn that ballot over and vote yes on one, because that's the state we want to live in for
frankly. We want to be the state where we don't feel that we don't have rights under our Constitution for all of us to be treated equally. And I know that that is true about New Yorkers. So we have to get past sort of the garbage filtering and just get this passed. Thank you.
Here we go. Final words. I think it's really important for the legal community to be talking to itself. I think it's really important that everyone in this room that understands the importance of what it means to change our founding document on the state level and how that reflects bigger, more important values that may not be utilized the week after it passes, but are certainly something that will be in conversation with us long after all of us are gone out of this world. So I think that what my call to action is that you all are talking to your people, that you all are telling your people about what this amendment is, what it does, and the importance of flipping their ballot and voting yes on number 1.
Great. And lastly, a reminder for how you can do all those things. You can take all the materials that we have. You can go to our website, yesonprop1ny.org. Please, please, please get involved. Don't turn to us on November 6th and say, I should have done this, I should have done that. Now is the time to plug in. You can call voters, you can text voters, you can knock on doors, you can do it from home. If you are a law student and you're on campus, you can get involved in our campus organizing work all across the state. Please, please, please join us in this fight. We can't do it without you. We need all hands on deck. It is a big state with a lot of noise, and we have to be able to cut through. So don't forget to flip your ballot and vote yes, and then join us to organize and go win this November. Thank you.
And tell all your friends, don't forget to flip your ballot.
Exactly.
I'm going to hand it back to Pam. Thanks for coming, and let's get out there and get this passed.
Thanks, everyone.
So I just want to thank all the panelists and the moderators for really informative and interesting. I know I learned a lot about the history and the process and what we can do in the next 42 days to make sure everyone knows to flip their ballot. So if we could give everyone a round of applause for coming out and informing us. And there are, we said this was going to 8:30, but one of the reasons we said that was because we want to give people a chance to mingle and talk among themselves and to talk to the panelists. And we do have some snacks through that back corner that you can help yourself to. And thank you everyone for coming out tonight and on this very important issue. Thank you.